The courthouse fire was supposed to be an accident, a tragedy, a loss of records. But the fire in Lowndes County, Alabama, did something far worse than destroy papers. It revealed a secret. As the flames died down, the smoke cleared, and the ashes settled, 3 bodies were found, chained, hidden inside the courthouse itself. Not buried, not hidden underground, chained like animals, as if someone wanted them to be discovered, or wanted them to be forgotten forever. Who were these people? Why were they chained? And why would anyone hide them inside a courthouse, the center of law and justice? The officials tried to explain it away. An accident, a tragedy, a loss of records. But the truth was darker, because those bodies didn't belong to random victims. They belonged to a secret that had been kept for years. The trail led to a plantation, the Sutton Plantation. It was one of the richest estates in Alabama, cotton fields stretching like endless seas, slaves working under the sun, a world built on forced labor and fear. At the center of it all was Colonel Nathaniel Sutton, a man who believed he owned not only land, but people and even blood. He was feared not only for his wealth, but for his power to control every aspect of life on the plantation. He didn't just own slaves, he bred them. He created a system, a private breeding program designed to produce more workers, more profit, more control. He didn't see them as human beings. He saw them as resources, tools, a machine. And he was proud of it. Inside the plantation house, there was a hidden world, a private world, a world where the colonel's secrets lived. 2 girls lived there, hidden from the world, raised in isolation, educated, taught to read, write, and behave like ladies. But they were still enslaved. They were his daughters and his property. The irony is chilling. A man who wanted perfect control over his property and his blood could not accept that his daughters were human. He kept them hidden, not because he loved them, but because he feared them. Because if the world learned the truth, the world would learn his greatest shame. To the outside world, the colonel was respectable, a powerful planter, a man of status. He attended meetings, hosted parties, maintained a perfect image. But inside the plantation, there was a different reality, a world built on secrets, fear, and cruelty. Rumors began to spread quietly. Not openly, not loudly, but like a disease spreading through whispers. Some said the colonel had mixed blood. Some said he had daughters he hid. Some said he was building a special kind of plantation. But no one dared to speak openly, because speaking could mean death, or worse, being forgotten. The plantation wasn't just a place of labor. It was a place of inheritance, a place where power was passed down through bloodlines. And the colonel's secret daughters were the key to that inheritance. But the colonel had other plans. When he died, he didn't leave a simple will. He left a trap, a cruel condition designed to control his daughters even after death. A test of loyalty, a test of obedience. The fire in the courthouse didn't just reveal the bodies, it revealed the truth behind them. The truth was hidden for years, and the fire forced it into the light. The plantation holds the answer, but the plantation is not safe. It is filled with people who would do anything to protect the secret. Even murder, even betrayal, even the destruction of innocence. The story is just beginning, and the deeper you dig, the darker it becomes. The daughters are hidden, the will is cruel, the plantation is a machine, and the secret is about to explode. If you're shocked by this story so far, smash the like button and subscribe for more. Comment below, do you think the Colonel's daughters will escape his control? And tell me where you're watching from. The Sutton Plantation was not just a property, it was a symbol of wealth, power, and control. But it was also a symbol of something darker, a secret that lived beneath the surface. The plantation's walls held more than just rooms and furniture. They held rules that controlled every breath a person took. In the fields, the slaves worked from sunrise to sunset. Their bodies were broken by the work. Their spirits were crushed by fear. But in the house, the cruelty was different. It wasn't physical, it was psychological, a silent cruelty that controlled the mind. Colonel Nathaniel Sutton was not a man who ruled through violence alone. He ruled through fear. He ruled through secrets. He ruled through control. He was a man who believed he could create the perfect future by controlling the past, and he had built a system to do it. He did not just own slaves, he owned the future. He owned the children. He owned the blood. His breeding program was not hidden. It was a part of the plantation's structure, a part of the system. He forced enslaved men and women to produce children. He controlled who would live, who would die, who would be sold, who would be kept. Every birth was a prophet. Every child was a future worker, a future tool, a future slave. But the colonel was not satisfied with just controlling the slaves. He wanted more. He wanted power over the bloodline. He wanted to create a legacy that would last forever. And for that, he needed heirs. He needed children who would continue his line. He needed someone who could carry his name. That's why the daughters were so important. Sarah and Catherine were not only his children, they were proof that he could control blood. But the colonel did not see them as daughters. He saw them as property, as tools. They were raised in isolation, not allowed to live normal lives, not allowed to be seen. They were educated, but education was not a gift. It was a weapon. They were taught to speak, to read, to write, but the purpose was not to free them. It was to prepare them to be controlled. The colonel wanted them to appear as proper ladies. He wanted them to marry respectable men. He wanted them to produce heirs, and he believed he could force them into it. The sisters grew up with the same constant fear, not of the field, not of the whip, but of the future. They knew they were not like other girls. They knew their father's secrets. They knew the truth about the plantation. But they were powerless. They had no voice, no freedom, no choice. And then,
One day, everything changed. The colonel died. His death should have been the end of his cruelty, but it was only the beginning. His will was read, and it was not a document of inheritance. It was a weapon. A cruel condition was placed on the daughters, a condition that would force them to marry and produce heirs, or lose everything. It was a trap. The plantation would remain theirs only if they obeyed, only if they followed his rules, only if they accepted his control, even after his death. The sisters were trapped in a nightmare designed by their own father. But the sisters did not plan to obey. They secretly despised him. They hated the control. They hated the cruelty. They hated the way he treated everyone as objects. They began to plan. They began to think of ways to escape the trap, to break the will, to destroy the control. But the plantation was not easy to escape. It was a machine, a system built to trap people inside. And the sisters were not alone. They needed someone who could help them. Someone strong, someone intelligent, someone who could understand the cruelty and survive it. Someone who could become the key to their freedom. Someone who could become the key to the entire plan. That person would appear soon, and his name was Marcus. But before Marcus arrived, the sisters had to prepare. They had to learn how to survive the will. They had to learn how to outsmart a man who had controlled everything. The plantation was a prison, and the sisters were trapped inside. But the fire had revealed the secret. The secret was now in the open, and the sisters were ready to fight back. The question was, could they win?
Colonel Nathaniel Sutton was not just a plantation owner. He was a man who believed he could control life itself. He controlled the fields, he controlled the workers, he controlled the money, and he controlled the blood. He believed that power was not given, it was taken, and he had taken it from everyone around him. He was feared by everyone, even those who worked closely with him. The slaves knew the sound of his footsteps. The house servants knew the look in his eyes. The overseers knew the punishment that followed disobedience. He ruled through fear. He ruled through secrecy. He ruled through silence. He didn't need to strike with a whip. A simple glance was enough. And he used that power to build his breeding program. He chose who would mate. He decided who would live and who would die. He decided who would be sold and who would be kept. He believed he was creating the perfect future, a future where the plantation would remain powerful forever. And he wasn't satisfied with just producing slaves. He wanted more. He wanted children who would carry his blood, children who would be his legacy. He wanted proof that he could control even the natural world. But there was one truth he could never accept. His own daughters were proof of his sin. Sarah and Catherine were born from the same system he created. They were the result of his cruelty. They were proof that he could not control everything. They were living reminders of his dark obsession. He raised them in isolation, not because he loved them, but because he feared them. He feared what the world would think. He feared the shame. He feared the truth. The sisters were taught to read and write. They were taught to speak properly. They were taught manners and etiquette. But the education was not a gift. It was a weapon. The colonel was preparing them for a life of obedience. He planned to marry them off, to secure the plantation's future, to keep the bloodline controlled. But the sisters saw the truth.
They understood the cruelty. They understood the plan, and they hated it. The colonel's control was not only over the slaves, it was over his daughters' lives, their bodies, their futures. The sisters began to hate their father not only for what he did, but for what he represented. He represented a world that saw people as property, a world that believed the rich had the right to control everyone else. The sisters began to dream of freedom, but freedom was a dangerous dream. In the plantation world, dreams could cost you everything. They started to watch the plantation closely. They watched the overseers, they watched the servants, they watched the guards. They listened to whispers, they listened to rumors. They learned what people feared. They learned that secrets were the only currency that mattered. And then the colonel died. The plantation changed instantly. The atmosphere became tense. The air became heavy with uncertainty. The will was read, and the sisters learned the truth. Their father had not left them a simple inheritance. He left them a cruel condition. They were forced to marry within 24 months. They were forced to produce legitimate heirs, or they would lose everything. The plantation would be taken away. The sisters would lose their home, their status, their future. It was a trap. It was a plan designed to control them even after death. But the sisters were not weak. They were not helpless. They were angry. They were intelligent. They were determined. They began to plan. They started to think of ways to break the will, ways to escape the trap, ways to take control. They needed someone who could help them, someone strong, someone intelligent, someone who understood the cruelty of the plantation. And soon, someone would enter their lives, someone who would change everything. His name was Marcus. But the sisters didn't know the full truth yet. They didn't know how far their father's cruelty went. They didn't know the secrets hidden inside the plantation. They didn't know what the future would demand from them. The story was far from over. The truth was about to become even darker.
The sisters' world was built on isolation, a world where the outside was forbidden, a world where every word was measured, every movement controlled, every relationship monitored. Sarah and Catherine grew up in silence. They were not allowed to mingle with the other girls, not allowed to laugh freely, not allowed to show emotion. They were taught to be proper, but proper meant obedient. Proper meant quiet. Proper meant invisible. Their education was strange. They learned to read and write. They learned history. They learned music. They learned how to speak like a lady. But they were never taught freedom. They were never taught love. They were never taught that they had a choice. They were raised to be tools. They were raised to be part of a plan. The sisters knew their father was cruel, but they didn't fully understand the depth of his cruelty until they were old enough to see the truth. They saw how the slaves were treated. They saw the fear in their eyes. They saw the pain in their faces. They saw the plantation as it really was, not as a beautiful estate, but as a prison. And they saw their own lives the same way. Their father's cruelty was not only physical, it was psychological, it was mental. He controlled their minds, he controlled their emotions, he controlled their future. The sisters were trapped, but their anger grew. It grew into something sharp, something dangerous. They began to plan. They began to talk in whispers, not loud, not obvious, but in hidden corners.
They discussed the will. They discussed the plantation. They discussed their future. They knew their father's condition was cruel. They knew it was impossible. How could they marry and produce heirs within 24 months? How could they do that without being controlled again? They realized they were being used. They were being forced into a life they never wanted. And the worst part was, they had no choice. But the sisters were not weak. They were not helpless. They were smart. They were brave. And they were ready to fight. They needed a plan. They needed someone to help them. They needed someone who could become the key to their freedom. They needed someone who could help them break the will. They needed someone who could change the future. That person was Marcus. Marcus was not like other slaves. He was educated. He was intelligent. He was strong. He had a mind that could understand the plantation's cruelty. He had a heart that could feel the pain. The sisters saw Marcus as their only hope. They needed someone to help them, someone who could stand up to the plantation's power, someone who could become their partner in the plan. But the plan was dangerous. The plantation was not a place where secrets stayed hidden. It was not a place where you could easily escape. The plantation was a machine built to protect itself, and the sisters were about to push that machine to its limits. But before Marcus arrived, the sisters had to prepare. They had to learn how to survive the will. They had to learn how to outsmart the plantation. They had to learn to keep their secret hidden. And the most dangerous part of all was that they had to pretend to obey. They had to act like obedient daughters. They had to act like they were still controlled. They had to act like they were still trapped. But in reality, they were planning their escape. They were planning their revenge. They were planning their freedom. The plantation was about to change, and the first step would be to bring Marcus into the plan. The question was, would Marcus trust them? And would he be willing to risk everything for their plan? The answer would determine everything. If this story is making your skin crawl, hit the like button and subscribe for more. Comment below, would you risk your life for freedom? Share this video with someone who loves dark, historical stories.
The will was read, and the plantation's silence was broken. Colonel Nathaniel Sutton had died, but his control did not end. It only changed form. His will was not a document of inheritance. It was a weapon. A cruel condition was placed on his daughters. They must marry within 24 months. They must produce legitimate heirs, or the plantation would be taken away, and the sisters would lose everything. This wasn't just a test of loyalty. It was a trap designed to control them forever. The sisters realized the full horror of the situation. Their father was still controlling their lives, even after death. The plantation was not theirs. It was still his. They were forced to become part of his plan. But the sisters refused to be controlled. They began to plan. They began to think of ways to break the will. But the will was a legal document, a legal trap, a legal prison. They needed a way to break the law. They needed a way to make the will useless. They needed a plan. They realized the only way to break the will was to find a loophole that would allow them to keep the plantation without obeying the condition. But the condition was clear. They had to produce heirs. So they decided to create a new kind of heir, an heir that would be legally accepted. But the plan required someone
someone who could be the father, someone who could be the legal husband, someone who could be the tool to break the will. And the plan was dangerous, because the plantation was not just a property, it was a symbol of power. If the sisters were discovered, they would be punished. They could be killed. They could be sold. They could be forgotten. But the sisters were determined. They were angry. They were clever. They were ready. They began to prepare the plan. They began to search for someone who could help them. They needed someone who could be trusted, someone who was intelligent, someone who was strong, someone who understood the cruelty of the plantation. Someone like Marcus. Marcus was a man who had survived the plantation. He was educated. He was strong. He had a mind that could understand the plan. The sisters realized Marcus was their only hope. They began to watch him. They observed his behavior. They watched how he spoke. They watched how he reacted. They realized Marcus was different. He was not like the other slaves. He was not broken. He was not defeated. He was alive. And that made him dangerous. But the sisters needed that danger. They needed his intelligence. They needed his strength. They needed his courage. They began to plan how to approach him. But the plan was risky. Marcus was a slave. He was not allowed to speak freely. He was not allowed to refuse. And if he refused, the sisters would be exposed. They had to make him trust them. They had to make him believe that the plan was worth the risk. They had to make him believe that freedom was possible. The sisters were ready to risk everything. But they had to be careful. The plantation was watching. The plantation was always watching. And the truth was, the plan would require something that would change everything. Something that would change the sisters' lives forever. Something that would force them to become more than daughters. It would force them to become mothers. It would force them to become liars. And it would force them to become criminals. The plan was about to begin. But the first step was to bring Marcus into their world. And the second step would be to make him trust them. The question was, would Marcus accept the plan? And if he accepted, what would it cost him? The answer would change everything.
Marcus arrived at the plantation like a shadow. He was not like the other slaves. He carried himself differently. He spoke differently. He moved with purpose. He had been educated somewhere else, somewhere beyond the plantation's walls, and that made him dangerous. He was a man who understood the world beyond the fields. He understood the power of knowledge. He understood the power of words. He was not just a worker. He was a thinker, a strategist. And that is why the sisters watched him. They watched his every move. They watched his conversations. They watched the way he looked at the plantation. Marcus did not seem broken. He did not seem defeated. He seemed alive. That was rare. That was dangerous. The sisters realized Marcus was the key to their plan, but they had to be careful, because approaching him would be risky. They needed a way to make him trust them. They needed a way to make him believe they were not like the others. So they started small. They began to communicate with him in secret, hidden conversations in corners, hidden words in the night, hidden messages in the shadows. They didn't tell him everything at once. They didn't reveal the plan immediately.
They started with small hints, small truths. They tested his reactions. They watched his eyes. They watched his expression. And Marcus began to understand. He realized that these sisters were not like other plantation women. They were not afraid. They were not obedient. They were dangerous. But danger can be attractive. Danger can be powerful. Marcus started to trust them, slowly, cautiously. The sisters offered him a deal. Freedom. Not just a promise, not just a dream, a plan, a way to escape, a way to leave the plantation, a way to live. But freedom always comes at a cost. The sisters told Marcus what the plan required. They told him he would be the father of their children. They told him the children would be the heirs. They told him the children would be the key to the plantation. And Marcus realized the plan was not simple. It was not just a scheme. It was a dangerous rebellion. The sisters wanted him to risk everything, and in return, they offered him something he had never experienced: hope. Marcus had never known true freedom. He had never known a life without chains, and the idea of leaving the plantation was like a dream. But the plan required a sacrifice. It required him to become part of the system, to become the father of children who would be used as tools. It required him to become a liar. It required him to become a criminal. Marcus had to decide. Would he accept the plan, or would he refuse? And if he refused, what would happen to the sisters? The plantation would destroy them. The sisters knew the risk, but they also knew they had no choice. They were trapped. The will was a prison. The plantation was a machine. They had to break the machine. Marcus had to become the key. But there was another layer to the plan. The sisters needed more than Marcus. They needed a way to make the marriages appear real. They needed men who would agree to a fake marriage, men who were desperate, men who were weak, men who were willing to do anything. The sisters would have to find those men. But first, Marcus had to accept. And Marcus had to decide if the price was worth the reward. The sisters waited. They watched him carefully. They watched his reaction. They watched his silence. The plantation held its breath, and the plan began to move.
Marcus accepted the plan. He did not accept it quickly. He did not accept it lightly. He accepted it because he understood the only truth that mattered in that world. Freedom is worth any cost. The plantation was not just a place of labor. It was a place of fear, a place where hope was punished, a place where dreams were crushed. Marcus had seen enough. He had lived enough. He had endured enough. He understood the cruelty of the plantation system better than most. He knew the risks. He knew the dangers. He knew what could happen if the sisters were discovered. But he also knew that staying would mean a lifetime of chains. So he agreed. He became part of their plan. And that decision changed everything. The sisters were relieved. They were excited. They were scared. They knew the plan was risky, but they also knew it was their only chance. Marcus became their partner, their secret weapon. But the plan required more than a partner. It required a method. The plan required a way to create heirs without exposing the truth. The sisters had to find a way to make their marriages look real. They had to find men who were desperate enough to accept a fake marriage, men who would agree to be part of the plan. They began to search. They searched among the plantation's workers. They searched among the nearby towns. They searched among men who had nothing to lose. They found men who were weak, men who were poor, men who were desperate. They found men who would do anything for money,
men who would do anything to escape their own misery. The sisters started negotiating. They offered them money, they offered them security, they offered them a way out. But the plan required more than money, it required secrecy. The men had to be silent, they had to act like the marriage was real, they had to act like the father was a respected planter, they had to act like the children were legitimate. And the men agreed. They were desperate, they were weak, they were willing to be controlled. But the plan was not only about marriage, it was also about the children. The sisters had to become mothers, not out of love, but out of survival. They had to produce heirs to keep the plantation. They had to produce heirs to break the will. And the idea of becoming mothers to keep the plantation was not simple, it was not emotional, it was not romantic. It was cold, it was calculated, it was survival. Marcus became the father. But Marcus was not just a father, he was a symbol of rebellion. He was the one who represented freedom, the one who represented hope, the one who represented the possibility of escaping the plantation. And the plan began to move forward. The sisters began to prepare. They began to act like obedient daughters. They began to act like they were accepting their fate. They wore the clothes, they practiced the manners, they acted like they were ready to obey. But inside, they were planning. The plantation continued to watch. The plantation continued to observe. The plantation continued to control. And the sisters continued to hide. They were hiding their true selves. They were hiding their anger. They were hiding their plan. The sisters began to live a double life. They were daughters in public. They were rebels in private. And the plan was not only about surviving, it was also about changing the future. The sisters wanted to break the system. They wanted to destroy the will. They wanted to destroy the control. But the plan required more than a will. It required courage. It required sacrifice. It required the ability to become someone else. And the sisters were willing to do it. But the plantation was not just a place, it was a symbol of power. And the power would not give up easily. The plantation would fight back. The plan would be tested. The sisters would be tested. Marcus would be tested. And the truth would be revealed. The question was not only whether the plan would succeed, but whether the plan would destroy them first.
The plan began to move forward. The sisters had found men willing to be part of the scheme. Men who were desperate. Men who were weak. Men who had nothing to lose. The plantation continued to watch. The plantation continued to control. The plantation continued to whisper. And the sisters continued to hide. They lived a double life. In public, they acted obedient. They acted respectful. They acted like daughters waiting to obey the will. But in private, they were rebels. They were plotting. They were planning. They were preparing. The plantation was not a place where secrets stayed hidden for long. Secrets were like sparks in a dry field. One small flame could ignite the whole plantation. And the sisters knew that. They knew that if they were discovered, the consequences would be deadly. But they also knew that the plan was their only chance. So they continued. The first step was to make the marriages appear real. They arranged meetings. They arranged gatherings. They arranged ceremonies. The men acted like husbands. The sisters acted like wives, and the plantation believed it. The men were not respected. They were not powerful, but they were the right kind of men, the kind that no one would question. The plantation accepted the marriages because the men were not important, because the men were weak. And that was the key. The sisters were safe because the plantation did not see them as dangerous. The plantation saw them as women who needed control. The plantation saw them as tools. The plantation did not see the rebellion. The plantation did not see the plan. But the plan was not only about marriage. The plan was about children. The sisters had to bear children. They had to become mothers, and the plantation would watch them closely. The sisters had to hide the truth. They had to hide the father. They had to hide the identity, and they had to hide the fact that the children were not truly legitimate. The sisters began to plan how to protect the children. They planned how to protect their future. They planned how to keep the plantation. They planned how to break the will. But the plan was not only about survival, it was also about morality. The sisters began to feel the weight of their actions. They began to question themselves. They began to ask, what kind of future are we creating? What kind of children are we producing? Are we becoming the same kind of monsters we despise? The sisters were forced to confront the cruelty of the system. They were forced to confront the truth that survival sometimes requires sacrifice. They were forced to confront the reality that freedom comes with a cost. Marcus began to struggle. He began to feel the weight of the plan. He began to realize that the plan was not only about freedom, it was also about becoming part of the system. He had to accept the fact that he would be used. He had to accept the fact that the children would be used. He had to accept that the sisters were using him. But Marcus also understood the reality. He understood that the plan was the only way. He understood that survival required sacrifice. And he continued. The plantation continued to watch. The plantation continued to control, and the plan continued to move forward. But the truth was still hidden. The secret was still safe. The question was, how long could it stay hidden? How long before the plantation discovered the truth? How long before the plan collapsed? The sisters were living on a knife edge, and the knife was getting sharper. The plan was moving forward, but the danger was growing. The secret was alive, but the plantation was alive too, and the plantation would not let go of control without a fight. If this story is keeping you on edge, hit the like button and subscribe for more. Comment below, do you think the plan will succeed, or will the plantation destroy them first? Share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries.
The plantation was alive with secrets. The sisters had built their plan. They had created a hidden world inside the plantation, a world where they could survive. But secrets have a way of leaking, and the plantation was not a quiet place. Whispers traveled fast, rumors spread like wildfire, and the smallest mistake could destroy everything. The sisters were careful. They hid the truth behind smiles and obedience. They acted like daughters who were trapped by their father's will. But the truth was that they were fighting back, and the plantation felt the change. The plantation felt the tension. The plantation felt the rebellion. The overseers began to watch more closely. The guards began to patrol more often. The servants began to whisper more often. Something was happening, and the sisters knew it. The plan required them to stay calm, to act normal, to act obedient. But the weight of the plan began to wear on them. The sisters began to feel the emotional toll. They were not only fighting for their freedom,
They were fighting against the cruelty that had shaped their lives. They were fighting against their own fear, and the fear was growing. Marcus began to notice changes. He began to notice the tension. He began to notice the whispers. He began to notice the fear. He began to realize that the plantation was not just watching the sisters, it was watching him too. Marcus realized that the plan had put him in danger. He realized that the plantation could destroy him if they found out, and the thought terrified him, because Marcus knew what would happen if he was discovered. He would be punished, he would be tortured, he would be killed. But he also knew that the plan was the only way. He also knew that the plan was their only hope, and the sisters needed him. The sisters were not only fighting for themselves, they were fighting for the future. They were fighting for the children. They were fighting for a life that was not controlled by the plantation. But the truth was still hidden. The children were still being born. The marriages were still being accepted. The plantation continued to believe the lie. But the sisters knew that the truth could not stay hidden forever. And then the worst thing happened. Marcus discovered something that changed everything. He discovered the full extent of the colonel's cruelty. He discovered that the colonel had infected many enslaved people with syphilis, intentionally. The colonel had used the disease as a tool, a weapon. He had infected people to control them, to destroy them, to make them weaker. And the worst part was that the sisters knew. They knew the colonel had done this, but they had not fully understood the depth of it. Marcus realized the cruelty was even worse than they had imagined. The plantation was not only built on slavery, it was built on disease, on infection, on death. The sisters realized that the colonel's cruelty had destroyed countless lives, and the plantation had hidden it. The sisters were forced to confront the truth. They were forced to face the fact that their father had not only used them as tools, he had used everyone. And the truth was that the sisters could not ignore it. They had to act. They had to do something. They could not allow the plantation to continue harming people. The sisters began to feel a strange change. They began to feel compassion. They began to feel guilt. They began to feel responsibility. They realized that their plan was not only about their freedom, it was also about justice. It was also about saving lives. And the sisters began to act differently. They began to help the sick. They began to treat them. They began to care for them. They used their wealth to buy medicine. They used their power to protect the sick. They began to become more than rebels. They became caretakers. And the plantation began to change. The sisters' compassion became a dangerous secret, because helping the sick meant spending money. It meant using resources. It meant drawing attention. The plantation began to notice. The plantation began to question. And the sisters realized that their plan was no longer only about survival. It was about humanity. And humanity was dangerous, because in a world built on cruelty, compassion is a form of rebellion.
The sisters' compassion was dangerous. In a plantation built on cruelty, caring for the sick was a rebellion. It was a crime against the system. And the system noticed.
The overseers began to question the sisters' actions. The guards began to watch more closely. The servants began to whisper. The sisters had to be careful. They had to hide the truth. But the truth was not only hidden in the shadows, it was hidden inside the sisters themselves. They were no longer the same girls who had been raised in isolation. They were changing. They were becoming something else. They were becoming women who had a purpose. They were becoming women who were willing to fight. And the plan was still moving forward. The marriages continued. The children continued to be born. The plantation continued to believe the lie. But the sisters were now balancing two worlds. A world of rebellion, a world of compassion. They had to hide both. They had to pretend to be obedient. They had to pretend to be normal. But inside, they were building a new future. Marcus was still part of the plan, but Marcus was also changing. He had begun to feel something he never expected. He began to feel respect, not just for the sisters, but for what they were doing. He began to see them as more than tools. He began to see them as people. And that changed everything. Marcus began to feel a strange loyalty, a loyalty that went beyond the plan, a loyalty that went beyond freedom. He began to feel something like trust. But trust was dangerous in a world built on betrayal. The sisters were still hiding the truth. The plantation was still watching, and the plan was still moving forward. But the sisters began to realize the true cost of their actions. They realized that the children they were producing were not just heirs, they were lives, human beings. They were forced to become mothers in a world where motherhood was used as a tool. And the sisters began to feel the weight of that responsibility. They began to wonder what kind of future they were creating. They began to wonder what kind of world their children would live in. Would their children be free, or would they be trapped like everyone else? The sisters began to feel fear. Not fear of the plantation, but fear of the future. They began to realize that the plan was not only about freedom, it was about change. It was about creating a new reality. But creating a new reality required sacrifice. It required a willingness to become more than they were. It required the courage to face the consequences. The sisters began to prepare for the worst. They began to prepare for the possibility of being discovered. They began to plan for the moment when the plantation would strike. They began to think about what they would do if the plan failed. They began to think about how they would protect the children. They began to think about how they would escape. And the truth was, the plantation was already planning. The plantation was not going to let go of control. The plantation was not going to allow the sisters to break the will. The plantation was going to fight back. And the fight was coming. The question was, when would the plantation strike? And how would the sisters respond? The answer would determine everything.
The plantation was changing. The sisters' plan was moving forward. The children were growing. The lies were multiplying. The danger was increasing. But the plantation was not the only thing changing. The sisters themselves were changing too. They had become stronger, more confident, more determined. But their strength came with a cost. The sisters were becoming more and more isolated. The plan required secrecy. Secrecy required distance. Distance required loneliness. They had become trapped in their own rebellion. They had become trapped in their own lives. And the plantation was still watching. The overseers began to grow suspicious. The servants began to whisper more. The guards began to patrol more often. The sisters began to feel the pressure. The pressure was not only from the plantation, it was from the truth. The truth was like a heavy stone inside them. The truth was waiting to explode. And then, one night, the truth almost did. A servant overheard a conversation about the plan, a conversation about the marriages, a conversation about Marcus. The servant did not understand the full meaning of what he heard, but he understood enough. He understood that something was wrong. He understood that the sisters were hiding something. The servant decided to tell someone, and in a plantation, information was power. The servant went to the overseer. The overseer listened carefully. He did not act immediately, but he began to watch. He began to observe the sisters. He began to follow their movements. He began to search for evidence. The sisters did not know. They continued to act normal. They continued to act obedient. They continued to act like daughters. But the truth was closing in. The overseer was not the only one watching. The plantation owner's family began to notice. The cousins, the relatives, the neighbors. They began to talk. They began to question. They began to suspect. The sisters realized the danger. They realized that their plan might be discovered. They realized that the plantation was not going to let them keep the inheritance without a fight. And the fight was coming. The sisters had to act. They had to protect the children. They had to protect the plan. They had to protect themselves. They began to take more extreme steps. They began to control the plantation more strictly. They began to act more like owners. They began to use their power to silence the whispers. They began to punish those who questioned. They began to intimidate. But the more they tried to control, the more suspicion grew. The plantation began to feel the tension. The plantation began to feel the fear. And the sisters began to feel the pressure. The question was, how far would they go to protect the plan? How far would they go to protect the truth? How far would they go to protect the children? The answer was dangerous, because the plan was no longer only about freedom. It was about survival. And survival in a plantation world meant one thing: control. If this story is getting intense, hit like and subscribe for more. Comment below, do you think the sisters will be exposed, or will they succeed in protecting the children? Share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries.
The plantation was changing. The sisters' plan was moving forward. The children were growing. The lies were multiplying. The danger was increasing. But the plantation was not the only thing changing. The sisters themselves were changing too. They had become stronger, more confident, more determined. But their strength came with a cost. The sisters were becoming more and more isolated. The plan required secrecy. Secrecy required distance. Distance required loneliness. They had become trapped in their own rebellion. They had become trapped in their own lives. And the plantation was still watching. The overseers began to grow suspicious. The servants began to whisper more. The guards began to patrol more often. The sisters began to feel the pressure. The pressure was not only from the plantation, it was from the truth. The truth was like a heavy stone inside them.
The truth was waiting to explode. And then, one night, the truth almost did. A servant overheard a conversation about the plan, a conversation about the marriages, a conversation about Marcus. The servant did not understand the full meaning of what he heard, but he understood enough. He understood that something was wrong. He understood that the sisters were hiding something. The servant decided to tell someone, and in a plantation, information was power. The servant went to the overseer. The overseer listened carefully. He did not act immediately, but he began to watch. He began to observe the sisters. He began to follow their movements. He began to search for evidence. The sisters did not know. They continued to act normal. They continued to act obedient. They continued to act like daughters. But the truth was closing in. The overseer was not the only one watching. The plantation owner's family began to notice. The cousins, the relatives, the neighbors. They began to talk. They began to question. They began to suspect. The sisters realized the danger. They realized that their plan might be discovered. They realized that the plantation was not going to let them keep the inheritance without a fight. And the fight was coming. The sisters had to act. They had to protect the children. They had to protect the plan. They had to protect themselves. They began to take more extreme steps. They began to control the plantation more strictly. They began to act more like owners. They began to use their power to silence the whispers. They began to punish those who questioned. They began to intimidate. But the more they tried to control, the more suspicion grew. The plantation began to feel the tension. The plantation began to feel the fear. And the sisters began to feel the pressure. The question was, how far would they go to protect the plan? How far would they go to protect the truth? How far would they go to protect the children? The answer was dangerous, because the plan was no longer only about freedom. It was about survival. And survival in a plantation world meant one thing: control. If this story is getting intense, hit like and subscribe for more. Comment below, do you think the sisters will be exposed, or will they succeed in protecting the children? Share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries.
The plantation reached a breaking point. The sisters could feel it. Every glance felt longer. Every question felt sharper. Every silence felt louder. The overseer's attention had changed. He was no longer observing casually. He was studying patterns. He was looking for proof. The sisters realized they were no longer invisible. The plantation had begun to push back. Small things started happening. A servant was reassigned without explanation. A trusted worker disappeared from the house. Records were reviewed. Accounts were questioned. The plantation was tightening its grip. The sisters knew this was how it began. Control always came before punishment. They began to realize that the system was not trying to expose them immediately. It was waiting for a mistake, waiting for fear, waiting for someone to break. Marcus felt it too. He felt the shift in the air. He felt the way eyes followed him longer than before. He felt the danger pressing closer. He knew what suspicion meant. Suspicion led to interrogation. Interrogation led to violence.
Violence led to death. Marcus began to prepare himself. He began to hide his emotions. He began to limit his movements. He began to distance himself from the sisters. It was the only way to protect them. The sisters noticed. They saw the change in Marcus. They felt the distance growing, and it terrified them. Because Marcus was not just part of the plan, Marcus was the center of it. If Marcus was exposed, everything would collapse. The sisters began to argue quietly, not with anger, with fear. One sister believed they should slow down, the other believed they should move faster. One believed they should hide, the other believed they should act. The plantation was forcing a decision, and time was running out. Then something unexpected happened. A visitor arrived, a relative, a man from outside the plantation. He came under the excuse of business, but his questions were too specific. His interest was too focused. He asked about the marriages. He asked about the children. He asked about Marcus. The sisters realized the truth. The plantation's suspicion had spread beyond its borders. This was no longer an internal problem. This was now a legal threat. A threat to the inheritance, a threat to the children, a threat to their lives. The sisters understood something terrifying. If the truth was exposed now, the law would not protect them. The law would destroy them. The children would be taken. Marcus would be executed. The sisters would lose everything. The plantation had cornered them, and for the first time, the sisters considered something they had avoided for years. What if survival meant doing something unforgivable? What if the only way forward was to silence the truth forever? The thought lingered, heavy, dangerous, unspoken. The plantation had pushed them too far, and when people are pushed too far, they stop thinking about morality. They start thinking about consequences. The next move would decide everything, and there would be no turning back.
The decision was made in silence. No words were spoken. No agreement was written, but both sisters understood. The plantation had gone too far. There would be no mercy from the system. There would be no justice from the law. There would be no protection for the children. The sisters were out of time. The visitor's presence changed everything. He stayed longer than expected. He asked more questions than necessary. He looked too closely at the records. He watched Marcus too carefully. The sisters understood what he was doing. He was building a case that would strip them of everything. They realized that the plantation was no longer just suspicious. It was preparing to act, and action meant destruction. That night, the sisters met alone. No servants, no witnesses, no light except a single candle. They did not talk about guilt. They did not talk about fear. They talked about survival. They talked about the children. They talked about Marcus. They talked about what would happen if the truth came out. They knew what the world would do. The world would call them criminals. The world would call Marcus a threat. The world would call the children mistakes. The world would not listen. The sisters reached a terrifying conclusion. If the truth could not be hidden, it had to be erased. The visitor had become a danger, not because he knew the truth, but because he was close enough to uncover it. And in a plantation system, suspicion was enough to kill. The sisters understood something deeply disturbing.
They were now thinking the way the plantation had taught them to think. Control, removal, silence. The very tools their father had used. The sisters hated themselves for it, but hatred did not change reality. The visitor was invited to stay for dinner. The house was calm, the table was full, the conversation was polite. Nothing seemed wrong, but underneath the politeness was intent. The sisters watched every movement, every sip of wine, every breath. Marcus was not present. He had been sent away deliberately. The sisters would not involve him. This was their decision, their burden. The visitor never left that house alive. By morning, his absence was explained as sudden illness, a rushed departure, a misunderstanding. The plantation accepted the explanation because the plantation wanted to, because questions were dangerous, because silence was safer. The sisters had crossed a line, and they knew it. They had done something irreversible. They had protected the children. They had protected the plan. They had protected the inheritance. But they had lost something else. They had lost innocence. They had become something the plantation respected, something it feared, and fear was power. The plantation became quiet again, too quiet, because silence after violence is never peace. It is waiting, and the sisters knew the truth. The plantation would not forget. The system never forgets, and the cost of survival would come due.
This chapter changes everything. Subscribe now to follow the final unraveling of this dark history. Comment below. Did the sisters have any other choice, or did the plantation force their hand? Like and share if you believe history hides more truths like this. The plantation survived. That was the cruel truth. The sisters kept the land. The children grew. The records remained intact. On the surface, nothing had changed, but underneath, everything was different. The plantation carried a stain that could never be washed away. The sisters moved forward carefully. They became quieter, more controlled, less visible. They no longer challenged the system openly. They had learned how to survive inside it. Marcus left soon after, not in chains, not in pursuit, but quietly. Money was arranged, papers were prepared, a route north was secured. The plantation allowed it to happen, because it was easier to let one man disappear than to reopen questions. Marcus never looked back. He carried the truth with him. But the truth did not follow. The children remained. They were raised as heirs. They were educated. They were protected. But the blood that ran through them was dangerous, because blood carried memory, and memory carried risk. The sisters watched their children carefully. They taught them obedience. They taught them silence. They taught them how to survive. They never spoke of the past. They never spoke of Marcus. They never spoke of the visitor. But the plantation remembered. Years passed. The sisters aged. The children inherited. The system endured. The plantation became quieter. Not peaceful. Quiet like something buried too deep to escape. Then, years later, the fire happened. The courthouse burned. Records were destroyed. Documents vanished. Truths were erased.
But fire has a way of revealing what was hidden. When the ashes cooled, something was found. 3 human remains, chained, buried, hidden. The plantation's silence was finally broken. People asked questions. Too late. The sisters were gone. Marcus was gone. The witnesses were gone. The system moved on. And that was the final cruelty. Not that the truth was hidden, but that when it surfaced, no one knew what to do with it. The story of the plantation became a rumor, a whisper, a local legend. Some said it was exaggerated. Some said it was false. Some said it was better forgotten. But history does not disappear. It waits. It hides in land records, in family names, in buried bones. The Sutton Plantation was not unique. It was a symbol of a system that forced people into impossible choices, a system that rewarded silence, a system that punished truth. The sisters were not heroes. They were not villains. They were products of a brutal world, a world where survival demanded cruelty, a world where morality was negotiable, a world where silence was safer than justice. And that is the most uncomfortable truth, because plantations are gone, but systems remain. And the question history leaves us with is not, what would they have done differently? It is, what would we? If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more untold histories like this. Comment below, what part of this story disturbed you the most? The system, the silence, or the choices? Share this video so these stories are not buried again.